Hello, everyone. Very, very pleased to see you, as it were, from a distance tonight. I am Dr. Peter Scott Brown, University of North Florida, Professor of Art History. And I will be speaking to you tonight from afar via this new Zoom machine that everybody's familiar with, about a classic work of American art. I must say, I wish that we were all together in the museum tonight in person or somewhere, but in this new universe that we live in, this is the best we can do. And while the museum is closed, I dearly wanted to be able to reach out and to share some of my teaching with the community. I'm a professor at UNF, of course, and when we moved to online teaching after the pandemic began, it was sort of traumatic for me and for my students, I think, because we're so used to the community of the classroom. And it was a great solace for me to be able to continue teaching via Zoom. And that's what gave me the notion that we could do something together via Zoom through the museum. It wasn't like being together in person. It wasn't like sharing the same room. But at the same time, we got together twice a week after the pandemic and talked about things that mattered and that we cared about and that were interesting and that kept us fresh and alive. It was certainly valuable for me. So I'm very pleased to be here with you tonight. I keep seeing new faces pop up. Hello, everyone. And I look forward very much to sharing with you the story of Frederic Remington's Bronco buster. This is a work of art that I'm sure a lot of people here already have seen before, they know about. In fact, I will say a brief story about my own boyhood. I recall at a very early age being taken to a museum somewhere, I have no idea where, and being told, this is a Frederic Remington, which meant nothing to me, of course, at the time. But I've carried that memory with me ever since as a memory of something that was ought to be significant. And in fact, I think probably Frederic Remington's Bronco buster is perhaps maybe the most famous work of American art, next to maybe Grant Wood's American Gothic or something like that. It's an absolutely iconic work of art. And a part of its fame is that it exists in multiple copies. Of course, there's not one Bronco buster. There's something like 285 licensed editions that were produced during Frederic Remington's lifetime. And that sheer, the numbers allow the work of art to have penetrated our American consciousness. Now, before I begin, I want to say a few words about the Zoom medium. I'm going to be taking questions after our talk today, and I'll take them via the chat function of Zoom. So if you explore the Zoom controls, you'll see there's a button for chat. And at any point during the talk, if a question occurs to you, you can jot that down, and we'll put that on our list of questions to talk about after I'm finished. I'll speak for about 40 or 45 minutes. And if you have any trouble or difficulty with the Zoom medium, you can use the chat function also to reach out to our co-host, Emily Moody, who's the programs director at the Cummer, who will help us try to resolve that issue. So in the meantime, I want to say that these are troubled and troubling times for many reasons in the past few weeks and months that we have lived here together in America. And I want to take this as an opportunity as well, this classic image by Frederic Remington, to revisit some of our ideas of America and to revisit some of our ideas of our own history. It's in that scrutiny of our own history that we find out a lot about our values, our choices, and the paths that have led us to the places that we are. That's certainly my perspective as a historian. So Frederic Remington's Bronco buster is, as I say, one of the most famous works of American art. It was produced, oops, I think I just pressed the wrong button. It was produced in 1895 originally, and this is the Cummer's version. And as I said, it exists in multiple versions. Originally produced in 1895 by Frederic Remington, who was at that point already quite a famous and well-established artist. This was surprisingly, however, his very first sculpture, which is kind of an astonishing fact. He went on to make many, many more sculptures, often very similar in theme, and men riding horses. In fact, if we looked at Frederic Remington's painting, we'll find the same thing. It's a lot of horses, a lot of men riding horses. And Remington is remembered as the classic Western artist, as we'll see. He had a special interest, though, in horses and in the power of the horse. And in that sense, this very classic American sculpture is a sculpture that also fits in, as I'll tell you tonight, into a very ancient tradition of equestrian statuary, of portraits of people on horses. And Remington was impressed, of course, by the power of the animal. For him, that was the key feature of it. As he said in talking about the Bronco buster, he says, "Only those who have ridden a Bronco the first time it was saddled or have lived through a railroad accident can form any conception of the solemnity of such experiences. Few Eastern people can appreciate the skyrocket bounds, the grunts, and the stiff-legged striking." That is obvious in the sculpture, this rearing horse, and the rough finish that he's given to the animal itself. This is not a highly polished and finished sculpture. The animal itself has something of the liquid medium of the bronze left in it. We feel in very delicate modeling and undulation in the surface of the animal, the musculature, the ribs under the rib cage. It's a very fluid creature, and the arcing pose of the animal as it leaps up is itself also very striking. And for me, as long as I've known it, this sculpture is one that has rather vexed me. There's a strange irony in casting in bronze something so dynamic. Bronze is a medium for producing something timeless and eternal, something unchanging, something profoundly durable. And there's nothing in nature, perhaps, that's quite as wild as the bucking bronco. The very idea of freezing it like this is ironic. The word bronco itself is interesting. It's a word that means rough. It comes from the Latin bruncus is the original etymology, meaning a knot of wood, an unbreakable knot of wood. And so the bronco itself is this unbreakably wild creature. I mean, that's our image of it. And of course, that's why in the sport of rodeo, which persists as a nostalgic pastime connected to the Wild West, the idea is not to ride the bronco. One never rides the bronco. The inevitable result of getting on the bronco's back is that one is bucked off. And that seems to be what's about to happen here in this image. The wild, rearing bronco rears up, and the rider hangs on as long as he can. But of course, inevitably, eventually, he's thrown. And all of that, the irony of this wild animal that's dynamic and powerful and uncontrollable being cast in timeless bronze, and the irony of the rider who is destined to be thrown off, being stuck in this permanent, eternal stasis on the back of the horse, is itself a kind of ironic tension with the medium. This sculpture has vexed me for other reasons as well. It's a sculpture that's over 100 years old now at this point, 125 to be precise. And yet it is one that has timely relevance. As I tell my students every time I include it in my classes. In fact, every US president since Gerald Ford, with the exception of George H.W. Bush, has adorned the Oval Office with Frederic Remington's Bronco buster, which to me, of course, as an art historian, means that this is a timely and a relevant and a living symbol of some sort. And the question is, what sort? I find it, again, as a source of irony to include the Bronco buster in the Oval Office, because, of course, the Bronco is wild and untamed and untamable. And the rider is going to be thrown. it's a fitting metaphor in some ways then for our notion of the executive presidency. That is, you come in and you ride the horse for 4 years or 8 years, but eventually you get chucked out, and that's it. The idea of the horse as the nation is a very powerful political metaphor and image of this wild and untamable and dynamic country, which cannot be tamed, cannot be broken by any one rider. And that's a very powerful image as well. It's a myth, really, this myth of America, of the cowboy hero, and of the untamable Bronco. We think of the Mustangs, of course, which are still iconic creatures of the West and iconic American animals. Mythology, though, is one thing. The reality is often quite different. Frederic Remington, who carved this sculpture, who modeled it, and who had it cast in bronze, was himself something of a myth. He engaged very much in myth-making about his own career. We think of him as a kind of cowboy type, as a wild and rough desperado. That's certainly how he represented himself when he came back from the West with a few crude drawings, which he sold to Collier's magazine in 1883. They were charmed by the drawings because they seemed to be so authentic and from such an original source, this rough-hewn cowboy from the West. They were so crude as drawings, though, that they had to be redrawn. The magazine actually hired illustrators to come in and to redraw his drawings, which were anecdotal drawings of frontier types, of mustachioed, behatted cowboys bellying up to the bar and playing with their six-shooters. That was the image that Remington projected of himself, this cowboy in a rakish hat. We can see in this rough sketch, this self-portrait that he did, the way that he uses the hatching and cross-hatching on his face cultivates this image of a lined and wrinkled western-faced, sunburned and leathery. Here he is, a self-portrait on a horse with his rifle slung across the saddle and eyeing the viewer on a rocky plain somewhere out west. The truth is somewhat different. Frederic Remington was from northern New York. In fact, not far from where my own family comes from, northern New York. And here he is in costume at Yale, where he was an art student, which I'm sure his professors would be interested to learn that his first drawings for publication had to be redrawn by professional artists. It doesn't say much for the Yale Art School, which after all is my alma mater too. So on behalf of him, I'm a little embarrassed. Frederic Remington was a student at Yale, at the Yale Art School. In fact, he played football for the Elis back in the 1870s. He was from a relatively well-to-do family, a family of journalists and of entrepreneurs and merchants. But he, by all accounts, as a child, was uncommonly lazy. As he said to his uncle when he was 16, "I have no desire for fame or for wealth that justifies the expenditure of any great energy on my part." He planned to just get by. As he said, he had one short life to live, and he wanted to enjoy it. In his success, of course, he put the lie to that lack of ambition. Frederic Remington was a man who really created himself out of whole cloth, as it were. And he certainly was ambitious. And his ambition is evident in the hundreds and thousands of works of art and copies of those works of art, which he produced and licensed and copyrighted and sold to make himself one of the great pioneers of cultural image making in America in the 20th century. But Remington was far from a cowboy. He did, in fact, live in the West for a brief period of time. In 1893, he got the grand idea to take his inheritance after his father died and buy a sheep farm in Kansas, which he held on to for a few months until he realized that ranching was hard work and boring. There were no bars around. And so he sold his sheep farm in Kansas at a loss. I went back and got some more money from his mother and moved to Kansas City, where he opened a hardware store, which promptly went bust. then bought half shares as a silent partner into a saloon where he spent the next few months of his life. He induced his young wife, Eva, to come down from New York and to live with him in Kansas City, but she didn't like his friends, who were rough fellows who hung around the bar, and she didn't like his crude drawings of their antics, which he did to amuse himself and his friends. And so finally, after losing her patience with him, she moved back to New York, and Frederic Remington had an awakening. It was while he was there in Kansas City, losing money on his stake in the bar and drawing and painting pictures to pay his rent, that he decided he could be an artist. And so he went back to New York and portrayed himself as a lifelong Westerner, as a cowboy, as a desperado, as a rough and ready type, which is quite ironic, because of course he never was. But in America, that's part of the charm of this country, is that you can come from anywhere and claim to be anything. And as long as you sell it and people buy it, then it turns out to be more true than not. At least that's how it was for Frederic Remington. Remington became tremendously successful, and he never cut the figure of the cowboy, I'm afraid. He was invited to too many parties. He was too popular. He ate and drank too much. And very shortly after he began to be successful as an artist, he ballooned in size, became a massive 300-pound figure who was a popular New York society figure for a time. He died, unfortunately, as a rather young man, in part as a result of the health conditions that resulted from his overindulgence. He never looked the part of the cowboy, but he talked it and he drew it. And that's how most people knew him, of course. Most people never met Frederic Remington, but they knew the Bronco Buster. They knew his drawings, they knew his illustrations. And those drawings and illustrations seemed so true to life, so real, that they sold the myth of the man. And so Frederic Remington has come down for many of us as an authentic cowboy. After his first illustrations were purchased by Collier's and Harper's Weekly, he soon began to be an in-demand illustrator for the weekly magazines, Harper's and Scribner's and Century and Collier's, and these very popular national magazines that were rather highbrow, but they also had a mass market. It just so happened, Frederic Remington timed it right. He came to New York to be an artist of the West at the moment that people in the East were desperate for images and representations of cowboy life. The Wild West, as we know it and as people lived it during its wildest parts, was coming to an end in the 1880s. The railroad had transformed everything, and the West was civilizing. There were art museums springing up from St. Louis to San Francisco. But the image of the West, the beginning of our cowboy myth, was really in its infancy at this moment in time. The 1880s, the 1890s, the beginning of the 20th century saw the rise of the popular image of the cowboy, even as the real life cowboy vanished from the map. One of Frederic Remington's early coups was to align himself with another Easterner who had pretensions to being a cowboy. He fell in with Theodore Roosevelt in the 1880s, and they collaborated on a series of publications for which Remington provided the illustrations and Roosevelt wrote the text. And later, Remington accompanied Roosevelt, joined the Rough Riders in Cuba and documented the war and the fighting there with Roosevelt at his side. In 1898, Remington gifted a copy of his Bronco Buster to Teddy Roosevelt, who responded that it was the greatest gift someone could ever receive and that no one would ever surpass it. The Bronco Buster certainly exemplified what Teddy Roosevelt thought and felt about the West. And it began to form the image of the West for America as well. One of the sources of Theodore or of Frederic Remington's impact has always been the fact that he was, from his earliest days, a commercial artist. this was a double-edged sword for him. It gave him an income that most artists could only dream of. He was an illustrator whose works were seen by thousands of people weekly in magazines across the country. And he began to paint more seriously. He took drawing lessons and art lessons when he got back to New York and thought he was going to be a serious artist. But he found it hard to break into the snooty galleries and the exhibitions where artists like Winslow Homer and artists of that generation, Whistler, were beating him in reputation. I think he had the last laugh, though, in many respects. I certainly think he would be pleased to know that his Bronco buster is a piece of Oval Office furniture, where neither of those artists have ever been displayed in such an elite setting. And he began to paint very seriously in the 1890s. In fact, Remington probably technically is a massively underrated painter still today because of the lingering taint of his commercial association. He began to paint initially and license his paintings for reproduction in magazines. And eventually he secured his financial independence by getting a contract, for instance, with Collier's Weekly, who paid him an enormous sum to paint one painting a month that would be reproduced in the magazine. He's known critically as a great colorist, as a great painter of landscape. In fact, he is. There's a wonderful, vivid quality to his landscapes and the colors, his sense of color in the West, which is really charming and quite beautiful to behold. He's also, of course, known for his subject matter, which is uniformly virile and masculine. It's cowboys and soldiers and horses and dramatic scenes in the West, which began to fuel our sense of the entire cowboy narrative at a moment in time when writers and authors and serials and eventually radio and cinema were producing enormous quantities of cowboy imagery that sold as fast as it could be produced. Remington, in fact, based his Bronco buster on one of his earlier sketches, or perhaps several of his earlier sketches. And this one is itself instructive. This is a sketch from a book which he illustrated, which was published by a journalist from the East Coast who wrote a book entitled, in 1893, entitled The West from a Car Window, which gives us a sense of how the West is changing. This is a travelogue and a book which is written quite directly to cater to tourists from the East Coast who want to take a tourist train car trip and go see the sights, to go and see a live cowboy and to visit a real live mine. And the way we do today, when we stop with our kids on the road and go into the mine and pan for gold and do the old miner's stuff, which is, of course, no more authentic today than it was, honestly, in Remington's time. That image of the 49er and of the cowboy and of the American West in its wild infancy was irradicably changed already in Remington's day. The sculpture, the Bronco buster, is of a piece with his earlier works. Although a bronze sculpture seems like a work of art that has great aura and it's a very fixed, a very solid, a very concrete thing, in fact, bronze sculptures can be produced in multiples, just as his illustrations were broadcast across the country and his paintings were reproduced in illustration. So the Bronco buster was produced in multiples. He sold them at Tiffany's, which doesn't seem like a cowboy boutique exactly, but he did great business with them. And in 5 years, he gained $6,000 from the sale of his Bronco buster casts. He was famed during this part of his career for something else, which gained Remington a reputation for authenticity. He was a wonderful painter of horses and of action scenes of horses in a way that we don't appreciate today how revolutionary it was. There's another image called Morning on the Range, which is very much like our Bronco buster. These images were based on Remington's study of photography. In fact, it wasn't until the invention of photography and until the photographic pioneer Edward Muybridge set up a series of motion-activated cameras to capture the gait of a horse in galloping that we really understood how horses moved. a galloping horse, the parts move too fast for the eye to record exactly what's happening when. And in fact, historically, galloping horses had been seen in this way, with the forelegs thrust out and the back legs thrust out, much like, for instance, an old American antique rocking horse or carousel horses. This was the image of the horse in movement, the galloping horse. Edward Muybridge's photographic experiments in 1879 radically changed that. And in fact, Remington was one of the first artists to use photography as a source for his painting of the movement of horses. He was quite famed for this in his own lifetime when he was painting. There are numerous newspaper articles and studies from the 1880s and 90s about how authentic his paintings of horses are, not because he was a cowboy, but because he's using the technology of photography. But nevertheless, that sense of authenticity, the sense of really knowing his subject, and the representation of the horse as this realist object gained him a tremendous reputation for knowing what he was doing, not just as an artist, but as a painter of his subjects, of cowboys, of horses. And that further bolstered Frederic Remington's personal narrative of himself as a cowboy. As he said to a friend of his once, it's quite a thing, isn't it? An old cow puncher like myself catching on in the New York art world. Well, that statement is only half true. He did catch on in the New York art world. This confluence of factors, his narrative, his story, the American interest in the cowboy, and the rise of photography, all of which contributed to Remington's astonishing success. He is certainly a producer of vivid and exciting images. In fact, this painting, A Dash for Timber, one of his famous paintings from the early phase of his career, is one that we can see already on the big screen. This looks like a scene from a movie, which will soon begin to thrill and to excite the American public. And Remington's art had a profound impact on cinema. When we see the rearing horse, Hi-Yo Silver, in the Lone Ranger television series, that horse is copying the Bronco Buster. They trained Silver to reenact this frozen in bronze static pose. Now, Silver's not trying to throw the rider in this case, but nevertheless, that iconic image of the Lone Ranger is very much based directly on Remington's ultra famous image of the cowboy. Take, for instance, the cover of an 1950s copy of the comic Silver, based on the adventures of the horse himself. Here we have the cover image, which is based directly on the Bronco Buster. Look at the planes of the face here of the horse, the expression on the horse's face. The artist has captured the visage of the Bronco Buster and transformed it into a children's cartoon, cementing Frederic Remington's influence on a generation that lived long after the great artist died. There he is, rearing again, Silver. Now, Frederic Remington's Bronco Buster has fascinated me for yet another reason, which is that I myself, I'm not a historian of American art precisely, I'm a historian of ancient and medieval art. And the Bronco Buster is an example of a form of statuary, which is very specific, as we call it in the business, the bronze equestrian statue. And all bronze equestrian statues, every single one of them, comes from a single source. There is only one surviving ancient bronze equestrian statue in existence. Of course, it was a very common form probably in the ancient world, but almost all of these bronze sculptures were melted down because bronze itself is a precious medium, which points to another interesting sort of characteristic of Frederic Remington's Bronco Buster, his choice of medium itself. This ancient medium, this medium associated with the elite and with power, and of course, defines an entire economic age of human civilization, the Bronze Age. And we used, for goodness sake, we used bronze for currency in many periods in human history. To make a sculpture out of bronze was a demonstration of power. To use it to enshrine the humble cowboy and the Bronco in our memory is yet another, is an entirely different matter. And all of these bronze equestrian statues that we have today, including, of course, our famous bronze equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson in Jacksonville, all of them come from a single source. And that is this statue of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, which is today located on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. A replica stands on the middle of the Capitoline Hill, what we call the Piazza Campidoglio, while the original has been moved into a museum just off the square. It survives for a funny reason, which contributes to its fame and which contributed to the vitality of this tradition of bronze equestrian statues. The bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius survives because no one remembered exactly who it depicted. In the Middle Ages, when the statue was standing in Rome, not on the Capitoline Hill, but outside of the Lateran Palace, it was already a famous object. As many people believed that it represented not Marcus Aurelius, but the Emperor Constantine, who was revered in medieval Rome as the Roman emperor who legalized Christianity, and who was regarded by many as the first Christian emperor of Rome. And so partly for that reason, the sculpture survived. People didn't want to melt down or destroy this precious sculpture, which was more valuable perhaps as a representation of Constantine than it was as bronze. Here, the sculpture is standing still outside of the Lateran Palace in the 1530s, and a drawing by the artist Martin van Heemskerk, just before it was moved to the Piazza Campidoglio. There were other legends, though, about who this sculpture represented. In fact, the tourist from the 12th century, a school teacher from England, his name was Magister Gregorius, Master Gregory, wrote a book about his visit. It's one of the first travel logs from the Middle Ages, his trip to Rome. And he talks about all the sites, and he spends the most time in his entire narrative talking about the statue of Marcus Aurelius. He recounts that, yes, some people think it is Constantine, but in fact, the locals, the Romans, they think it's this other fellow whose name is Marcus Curtius. Now, maybe there's a good reason why the Romans didn't like the idea that it was Constantine. Constantine might have legalized Christianity and might have had been very popular for that reason in some parts of the world, but he was also the emperor who moved the capital of Rome to Byzantium, or to Constantinople, and thus left Rome in a kind of political and economic vacuum for the next 1,000 years. So there's some reasons why perhaps Constantine wasn't so popular in Rome, but Marcus Curtius, this fellow on the horse here, was a legendary Roman Republican soldier during the era of the Roman Republic. And according to legend, a great fiery pit opened up right in the middle of the Roman Forum, in the heart of Roman government. And the soothsayers and the oracles declared that the pit, which was the pit of Hades itself, would not close until Rome had sacrificed its most valuable and precious possession. Well, the Roman citizens went to all the old men in the city and asked if there were any old men willing to sacrifice themselves to the pit, having been led full lives, and on the basis that perhaps Rome's most precious possession was its senators, a word which literally comes from the Latin senex, meaning old man. The senators all declined, however. As much as they loved Rome, none of them felt like they were done living yet. That's when Marcus Curtius, this young soldier, stepped up and said he would do it because, by golly, the most precious possession of Rome was the bravery and the moral integrity of its citizens. And so saying, he stood on the horse and leapt into the chasm, and immediately a cuckoo flew out, and the chasm sealed up, and Rome was saved by the bravery of Marcus Curtius. Now, in the Middle Ages, they said that the confirmation that this was Marcus Curtius was the cuckoo nestled on the top of the horse's head, which is a creative interpretation of this tuft of hair that sticks up on the horse's brow. In fact, none of those interpretations were correct. It is not Constantine. It is not Marcus Curtius. It is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, as we know now, and as they had known for some time in the Renaissance, when the statue was moved to the Piazza Campidoglio. Marcus Aurelius himself is an interesting character, however. He's known as a philosopher emperor. There are a number of features of this sculpture which are really quite important for us to consider in terms of understanding its meaning and the meaning of all bronze equestrian statues in some sense. The horse was a powerful symbol in the ancient Roman world and as well in the medieval world. In this case, we see Marcus Aurelius with a firm hand on the reins, holding this very powerful horse. It's a war horse, but he's not going to war. In fact, he's dressed in the robes of a senator or a philosopher. And he holds his hand out in a gesture known as the gesture of adlocutio. It's a gesture of oratory or of speaking. And the horse, this symbol of passion, of strength, of fierce power, it is here held under control, restrained by the emperor. And that is a crucial piece of the meaning of the equestrian portrait in almost every instance, that the writer is here exerting control over the powerful animal. The equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius is the source for almost every equestrian statue that comes after, either directly or indirectly. The very first bronze equestrian statue that we know of after the Roman period of Roman antiquity is this one, depicting the great Imperial Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. It is based, in fact, directly on the model of Marcus Aurelius. And one of the ways that we know, of course, there's always a wonderful little historical fact about the stirrups. There are no stirrups in Charlemagne's image. In Marcus Aurelius' time, there were no stirrups in Rome. Stirrups were an invention of the Scythian and Middle Eastern horse tribes people who pioneered many of the technologies of riding. But by Charlemagne's time, stirrups were in common usage. They have omitted the stirrups in part to make a connection to the statue of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Charlemagne makes a few changes. He holds a globe in his hand and held a sword as well for a more militaristic image. The first Renaissance equestrian bronze statue is that of Erasmo de Narni, known as Gattamelata, who was the general of the Venetian armies. He holds in his hand, instead of an adlocutio gesture, he has a rod signifying his power. And here he now is gifted with stirrups. His horse rests his hoof on a cannonball, which is one of the first of the new signs of the modern warfare, which creeps into this very ancient image. It's again an image about control or restraint. The war horse is powerful, it poses itself on a cannonball, but the rider is very much in control because, of course, the army and control of the army is not simply about violence, it's not about conflict, it's about control, it's about restraint, it's about judicious behavior. When Michelangelo moved the statue of Marcus Aurelius to the Piazza Campidoglio, which he designed and refurbished in the 1530s, the statue had yet another meaning. Michelangelo had just fled Florence, where he had lived his entire life, to become a citizen of Rome when the Roman Republic, or the Florentine Republic, was overthrown by the Medicean tyrants. And in the end, of course, Michelangelo lived out much the rest of his life in Rome, working in the Sistine Chapel, and here refurbishing the Piazza Campidoglio. But for him, the statue of Marcus Aurelius, combined with his work on renewing and restoring Rome, was a symbol of renewal of the ancient Roman Republican city. And so for him and a number of other Florentine exiles, Republican stalwarts, the statue became a symbol of the Republic, which was ironic when Cosimo I, the tyrant Duke of Florence, had himself represented in the form of Marcus Aurelius on horseback. Louis XIV, not to be left out, the great Sun King, here looking a bit bizarre, wearing Roman sandals without stirrups, but a 17th century French wig. That is a little bit bizarre. You can see here holding out a gesture which recalls the gesture of adlocutio in Marcus Aurelius' sculpture. To our own country, and George Washington here represented in a similar posture and gesture, the horse recalling that of Marcus Aurelius. All the way to the end of the 19th century, and here's Paul Revere in a very similar manner, recalling the old statue of Marcus Aurelius. Which leads us to Frederic Remington, whose horse has a slightly different posture, of course. There is a variant on the Marcus Aurelius type, which is the rearing horse. It begins, or it is found perhaps first in Bernini's version of the horse, which he produced here in marble for the Vatican Palace at St. Peter's, depicting Constantine, the emperor, of course, having his vision, rearing up on a horse. The rearing horse is a more dynamic composition. For Bernini, that worked appropriately during the Baroque as an expression of power, of energy, of strength, of dynamism. But most of the people who have had themselves represented with the rearing horse are imperial figures. And they see this, I think, as in Peter the Great here, as a reference to the idea of conquest, the horse as a symbol of military triumph, of imperial rule and control. The rearing horse is a more violent horse, a more aggressive horse. Here we have Philip IV, one of the great kings of Spain, represented in a monument which was erected in 1843 to recall the imperial ambitions of Spain in earlier centuries. To Napoleon, for instance, who, when he was painted by David on horseback, he asked David said, "I'm going to paint you in the style of Marcus Aurelius on horseback." And Napoleon said, no, make the horse more violent, but show me calm and in control without any fear or anxiety on my face, even as the horse plunges and rears. And that horse, that posture of the horse, is perhaps the same posture we see here in the statue of Andrew Jackson. Now this statue, which many of us know because of course it's iconic in the city of Jacksonville as well, is in fact the very first bronze equestrian statue produced in the United States of America. It was a symbol when it was erected in 1853, long after Andrew Jackson died and after his presidency. It was a symbol of American enterprise and of business, of energy, of American economic power, and of the strength of the Union. Clark Mills actually set up his own foundry in order to produce this. And it was taken as a shift in America from European to American soil of an industrial manufacturing base, which would bear fruit over the course of the next century, of course, the American century, the great wealth of the country that was generated through economic enterprise in the 20th century. For Jackson, however, this sculpture for the public in the time that it was erected, it represented something else. It was produced in the years leading up to the Civil War. And this was a monument that was commissioned and erected very much as a monument, not to Jackson, but to the Union itself, to the country. In fact, the inscription on the base of the pedestal of the statue is a very famous quote from Jackson. Our Union, our federal Union, it must be preserved. This was a toast he offered in defending the idea of the Union, the idea of our belonging in a community as a country with shared values. A quote that went to his defense of the country against secessionists in the 1830s, against his own Vice President, John Calhoun, who had challenged the idea that the Union and our participation in a country of common cause was the most important American value. Here we have our own Jacksonvillian version, which was cast in 1987, which leads us back to Remington himself and the Bronco buster. The horse in Andrew Jackson's sculpture is not an imperial horse. It's not a militaristic horse. In fact, it is, as you can see, a horse that is rearing, raring to go. Jackson doffs his cap, hardly an imperial or conquering gesture. Even though we remember Jackson as a general, he is in this image not in the posture of an active military commander. He's saluting us. The doffing of the cap is a gesture of respect that goes back to distant ancient times, at least to the Middle Ages. The rearing horse here is itself the Republic, I think. That is a fractious and energetic horse, a steed that is difficult to ride, that is difficult to control, and that needs a calm and firm hand on the reins, as the saying goes. Remington's sculpture takes off on that idea of the horse's energy. And when we think of this sculpture here, for instance, in Reagan's Oval Office, or in Barack Obama's, or in Donald Trump's, we can think of this bronze sculpture, the wonderful Bronco buster, as a symbol of American vitality, of the dynamic energy of the steed, which in Jackson's sculpture is one that requires a firm hand on the reins, and in Remington's requires a little bit more humility than that. In Remington's sculpture, the Bronco as a true American image, as a figure of American strength and enterprise and self-invention and vitality and unbreakable energy, is a steed that cannot be ridden exactly. It's only one that we can hang on to briefly, or if you're lucky, like the Cowboy and Remington sculpture, you could hang on just barely forever. But the horse itself, the Bronco, was, I think, what mattered for Remington, as it did in most of his works. I think he's been confused by the American public for a long time as a painter of cowboys, when I think, in fact, it may be safer to say that he's a painter of cowboys' horses. The horse was, for Remington, the true symbol of the West. In Obama's Oval Office, the horse is hung beneath a painting by Norman Rockwell, which I'll conclude with tonight. A painting by Norman Rockwell, which was originally, much like the Bronco buster and Frederic Remington's work, a work which belonged to popular culture, which graced the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in an earlier age. It's a painting known as Working on Liberty, and it depicts the annual cleaning of the torch of the Statue of Liberty, which is a process that still takes place every year. A group of workmen, all skilled and enterprising workmen, are up hanging off of ropes in the high enclosure of the torch, cleaning and working on liberty. Remington, or I will say Rockwell, it's quite interesting to note, included in this group a range of different types of people, including, it has only recently come to light, an African-American man who works alongside the others, cleaning and polishing the torch. At the time that he made this image for the Saturday Evening Post, that magazine had a policy against representing African Americans in equal position and status with whites. And Rockwell was consciously, intentionally subverting that norm. I think that the juxtaposition of these two objects is a beautiful reminder of American past and American values that I'm glad to have shared with you tonight. As the museum is closed and as we wait to get back and to go see some of our favorite things, I'll just remind you that museums are not only public resources for beauty, they are also the places we keep our stories. And those stories tell us a lot about who we are and how we've come to be. As a historian, this is what I think about constantly. I'm pleased to have shared this story with you tonight, and I look forward now to taking your questions. Thank you all very, very, very much. So I do have some questions which are coming in right now. So how was it determined that the statue was Marcus Aurelius? In fact, it's quite a fascinating story of the beginning of my own discipline. For hundreds of years, people took it for granted that the statue was either Constantine or Marcus Curtius, or in fact, a number of other personalities that were made up to go with the sculpture. In the 15th century, as scholars were beginning to pioneer the very first practices of archaeology, collectors of Roman antiquities began to assemble large numbers of busts and portrait statues, and they began the painstaking process that we still teach in our Introduction to Roman Art courses today, introducing the world to the personalities and the identities of the actual Roman emperors. And so there are numbers of portraits of Marcus Aurelius that are easy to match once you know one of them, and the coinage, the busts, the statues, easy to match to the portrait itself. So from about 1485, I believe, it was known by scholars that the statue of Marcus Aurelius was Marcus Aurelius. But in fact, even in Michelangelo's time, the Pope seemed to think it was not Marcus Aurelius, but his predecessor, Antoninus Pius. So is there any significance to the change in ratios between the rider and the horse throughout this period? And I will say, yes, there are two issues at stake here. One is that in the course of the history of art, as artists change in style, they're just simply different aesthetic notions about proportion and proportionality. And so part of the proportion changes have to do with that. But then in other cases, size is very important, not just the proportion of the horse and the rider, but scale itself. So the Marcus Aurelius sculpture is larger than life size. And quite a few other sculptures have been made conspicuously life-size in order not to exaggerate or contribute to an impression of heroic exaggeration of the figure. I think it's quite interesting to me that the Remington sculpture is so small scale. That, of course, was done precisely because nobody will buy large numbers of huge bronze statues. But when you can fit on a credenza next to the window, it sells much better, as Remington wisely knew. Are there any famous equestrian statues that do not depict a stallion? No, there are not that I know of, to be honest, but there are famous equestrian statues that don't depict a male rider. And Joan of Arc is a very common equestrian statuary figure. Lady Godiva makes a turn or two. And then there are many others as well. I've only shown you a few. There are literally now, of course, thousands of bronze equestrian statues. We find them all over the place. And in fact, it's a fair claim to say that your city is not really worth its salt unless you've got at least one lying around somewhere. Do you think the Remington rider might represent the power of the American individual instead of the emperor type? Now, I think that's a wonderful question. I'm going to repeat this question. It's a wonderful question. Do you think the Remington rider might represent the power of the American individual instead of the emperor type? Yes. Yes. In fact, I don't think that we're in the business in America of making imperial equestrian type statues. Even Jackson, who often gets accused of being a militaristic emperor, an emperor of manifest, or a president of manifest destiny, a conquering president. In that statue, he's doffing his cap, which I'll just tell you very briefly. Doffing the cap is a gesture that goes back to medieval chivalric codes, when you would take off your helmet in order to show that you were among friends and that you regarded the people in front of you as equals and that you had nothing to fear from each other. That gesture of doffing the cap is the opposite of militaristic. I really think that that sculpture, which again often gets conflated with the idea of Jackson as a general, is about Jackson trying to hold the country back from war, restraining this fractious country from the energy and the violence and the dynamic urgency that is in the muscles of the horse. Is there a connection between the interest in the American West and interest in the East, Orientalist depictions of the East? Both, from my memory, are occurring around the same time period, although depicting different subjects and landscapes. Images of the American West and the Orientalist East seem to feature dynamic false narratives. That's a really brilliant question that requires a lot of art history to give a fair answer. But the simple answer is yes, absolutely. And part of this goes back to exactly the art economy that produces Frederic Remington. We're at a turning point in American culture and in the culture of the West generally. The beginning of a period during which cultural image in a variety of media, not just traditional media like sculpture and painting, but in print and illustration and then cinema and radio and comic books and all of the other sort of consumable media that we still consume in mass quantities today. It's at this moment in time that an exotic image of the East, of the West, a nostalgic and fanciful image that begins to form around a number of these popular images of places, of cultures, of distant locales. It's connected to the growing wealth in America, the capacity to travel, the ability to go and see things. and it feeds and nourishes that interest and that desire. Remington's publication there with the author of The West from a Car, Views of the West from a Car, is a classic example of that, of a quasi-artistic enterprise that nourishes a popular interest in a romantic and nostalgic subject. Would I speak to the Remington Museum in Corning, New York? Yes, I would if they asked me. I'd be delighted. And this is a good question. Are you teaching any classes that I can look out for in the upcoming semesters? Yes, always. I have new classes coming up always. And gosh, off the top of my head, I can't think what I'm teaching in the fall, but I think I'm teaching my medieval art course, my beginning to the end of the Middle Ages course. I'd love to have, I love having auditors and I love having community participants. So would always be pleased to have visitors. When and how was Remington's work reevaluated and determined as being artistically significant beyond his work as an illustrator? That's a good question as well. You know, so for a very, very long time, Remington lapsed into a kind of critical obscurity because he was painting this modernist and this narrative art at the same moment in time that we think of the great abstract and expressionist artists of the early 20th century, Picasso and Braque and Kandinsky and Mondrian, real aesthetic pioneers, were changing the whole landscape of high art. And so Frederic Remington came to look pretty old-fashioned very quickly, even as he remained a popular commercial artist, his work now being consumed and reproduced in cinema and other forms of media. So it's not until really the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, that Remington began to be critically reconsidered by art historians as someone who had a really fascinating perspective on the American story. An Americanist art historians, one of my teachers, Alexander Nemiroff, for instance, is a wonderful expert on Remington, who has given us a whole new perspective on what these paintings mean, not just as works of art, but as works that document and record an American self-image and an American narrative about how the country came to be, what the West is, how we identify with that past, which is as fanciful oftentimes as it is factual, sometimes more so. It's hard to tell, but is the figure in the painting at the top of the African-American, at the top, the African-American? So yes, it's not at the very top. In fact, this fellow is in shadows. It's hard to say what's going on there. This is Norman Rockwell himself with the pipe in his mouth. And I believe the African-American figure is here working on the side, on the right-hand side of the torch. And then here we have the bringing up buckets here and these long, long ropes from down below of, I don't know what, of water and solvent and cleaning solution. But apparently the torch is still cleaned. I'm sure the procedure has changed since then, still cleaned annually. It's a beautiful metaphor, the need for renewal. And as we know, the care and keeping of works of art is a complicated endeavor, and works of art require great custodianship, as the Cummer Museum well knows, protecting things and preserving them, keeping them whole and integral for the future so that their beauty and meaning can nourish generations to come. That renewal, that cleaning, that refreshing, that is something we ought to take very seriously in this image as a metaphor for the entire American project. I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. The timing of Remington and Teddy Roosevelt suggests that one benefited from the other. Absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a whole book to be written about their relationship because they worked together and collaborated together for well over a decade, and on the Cowboy front and in Cuba. And both of them were very much engaged in self-myth making. As we know, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt is a hugely important figure in American life and culture. both of these men had very similar romantic and completely implausible images of what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be an American man, what it meant to be a soldier or a cowboy, to be strong. And their images were based in fancy, even as they themselves were, very different from the images that they had. As I said, I read you that wonderful quote at the beginning about Remington talking about the Bronco. Only those who've been on a Bronco or have been in a railroad accident can possibly understand what it's like to ride such a creature. Well, I would be shocked, honestly, if Frederic Remington had ever been on a Bronco the first time, the first person to ride one. He certainly visited the West. And after he was a correspondent for newspapers with Teddy Roosevelt, he was sent by his publishers on trips to go and study the West. But he went very much as Magister Gregorius or the guy in the car, that is witnessing things as a visitor, as a tourist, as someone taking notes in order to report a story. And Teddy Roosevelt certainly in his early publications was engaged in the same kind of myth making. A lot of what they wrote can be read, easily accessed online. The Century magazine, for instance, the images I showed are from an article called Frontier Types that Teddy Roosevelt wrote in 1888, which is just full of the most bizarre, and you have to imagine, completely false anecdotes about things that he's seen. And they're full of stereotypes that still exist for us because of the American cowboy image from cinema. Stereotypes of rough and silent and dark cowboys and squirrely, effete men who run the bank and the post office and the kinds of women and the kinds of the drunkards and the kinds of ranch hands that we imagine to have existed. Teddy Roosevelt's characterizations are really vivid and interesting, but I don't think we can take them as fact any more than Remington's illustrations. And I'll take one more question here, which is a good one. Is there a symbolism to horses having two or no foot in the air? As you can see, here we have the rearing horse, which we have so many horse expressions. I jotted a bunch of them down before our talk so that I could remember them. But I love the rearing horse because it reminds us of our American cowboy expression, raring to go, rearing up, taking both front feet off the ground. Those images of the rearing horse are images that accentuate the energy and the dynamism and the violence of the horse's physical power. And so appropriate then, in some cases, for the image of a powerful emperor or ruler who controls this powerful animal. In the Bronco Buster, of course, the cowboy is not in control. He's just barely hanging on. And so that rearing posture has a different meaning. It's a meaning that is about the unbreakableness of the animal itself, its power and its spirit. I think that the delicately posed hoof, for instance, of the standard equestrian statue, the Marcus Aurelius, is a sign of just how careful the emperor's control is. Again, we have lots of expressions that relate to this. The one that comes to mind here is hold your horses, right? The horses are ready to go, but holding your horses is this metaphor, this idiom for keeping a firm hand on the reins and holding the horse back. That expression, hold your horses, is actually incredibly ancient. It goes back to the Iliad. Homer wrote, hold your horses in his Iliad in order to describe the wild driving of Antilochus in a chariot race. So I think that delicately posed hoof raised on the ground is a sign of just how controlled, how restrained, how judicious the rider is in managing the steed, this powerful animal that could rear up and could go crazy at any moment, but is under the firm and the careful and the wise control of the rider. There's a popular conspiracy theory or a popular mythology that the hoof raised up or not is a symbol of whether the rider died in battle or not. And there actually seems to be no truth to that. Sometimes you read that the right hoof up or the left hoof up or something like that is associated with whether the rider was a deceased soldier in battle. But I don't believe that that has actually any truth to it. So I will say on that note that it has been a great pleasure. We're going to give 2 more of these lockdown lectures as we anticipate reopening at the Cummer. I would be very pleased if all of you would join us again for those. Next lecture is going to be about a fascinating and completely original, totally original African-American artist from the 1960s named Bob Thompson, who has a striking and really fascinating painting in the Cummer. There's another great American story to tell there as well. And I'll look forward to sharing with you next time. I want to wish everybody a good night. Everybody take care, be safe, and I will see you in the future. All my best.
Thank you, Scott. This was an extraordinary lecture. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think everyone did. Very much appreciate you taking the time. It gives us another reason to come back to the Cummer, and not just to see the bucking Bronco, but to also see the extraordinary American collection that is housed at the Cummer Museum. So thank you for taking the time to present this to us. It was a great lecture.
Thank you so much, Diane. Take care, everyone.